now unmute. Can everybody hear me? Thanks, Naisha, and for Sheridan for inviting me to share a little bit of my work, but also a little bit of my heart, hopefully. It's the first time I've ever shared anything that I've done academically in the world, so I've been a little bit nervous about it, but I heard a really cool quote today in a Lent reflection, and the person sharing said, if we focus on virtues, we become competitors. But if we focus on vices, we become brothers and sisters. And that really was what I needed to hear this morning, because I'm really conscious, I think, and particularly in the academic world, and particularly even in our church tradition, it can be quite easily to become competitors. And even among women. And so I really hope that our time together tonight can be one that bonds us as sisters, as opposed to forging any sense of being in competition with one another. Sheridan, if you could just pop up the first slide. I have asked Sheridan to manage the slides tonight because my tech at the side isn't great if I try and do it. The connection's not that great. So please be patient as we sort of muddle our way through the slides. But tonight I'm going to talk to you about my dissertation that I wrote last year as part of my postgraduate diploma in Pastoral Theology, and I named it The Gift of Desperation. And it's exploring and looking at how the strengths and benefits of the 12-step program could be enhancing to wider church culture. So if you just want to flick on, I'll just do a bit of core YO, who am I? Ko Taratahi is my maunga, so that's known as Mount Holdsworth, that's in Masterton. Ati Whakatau is my awa, my river, which sits just nestled underneath the maunga of Mount Holdsworth, and that I try and visit every year to really enjoy the river, and taking my girls back to the river every year is a really important rhythm of my life now. The two girls that you see on the left there, ko Libby J and Rawa, ko Leah Taku Tamariki. So I have two lovely daughters. And in the bottom right, there's a picture of Te Whanganui Ātara, which is Wellington, which is a place that I find comforts me and brings me strength. And it's where I whakapapatu, it's where my ancestors are all from. And I just put the picture of the waka in the middle because I thought I'd share with you that I've just started waka ama. And that's been a real treat in my life, and it's really hard, but it's also really good for me. And I love, probably from, you can see the pictures and the colours and the screen, that I love nature, I love the outdoors, and I love the water. And Naisha, I wore green today and didn't realise that it was St. Patrick's Day, so here we are. So that was a fluke. So we can just move on, Sheridan, to the next slide. This work for me really was born out of my own personal story, as you've heard in my introduction. 6 years ago I found myself in the side room of a Quaker hall, not so much the basement, but the side room of a Quaker hall, I think probably sharing more honestly about my life and my relationship with God than I had up until that point probably ever in the church. And I guess that, that experience and just personal experiences in my life, particularly over the last 3 years, I've had a desire for that to, I guess, become an offering to the church. I feel deeply passionate about the church. And so I'm daring to believe that some of the experiences I've had and the journey that it's been would become some kind of offering to the church. And This particular piece of writing came out of this quote by Nadia Bowles-Weber in a radio interview that she did a few years back now. Nadia Bowles-Weber is an ordained Lutheran minister. She's a recovering alcoholic herself, and a theologian and a Christian author. And she said this, that the basement of the church is more full of people talking honestly about their lives and connecting with some kind of God more frequently than in its sanctuaries. And it's quite a provocative statement. I get that. I also think it's really important for me to locate my work as a Pākehā woman, I guess reflecting on the Western church as I have known it, and as I've experienced it to be. So I want to put that out there as well. So yeah, you might have some personal kind of reactions or responses to that quote, and it'd be great to toss some of those around later in the question time. On the next slide, I just moved through talking a little bit more about the culture that this is located in. And I've just popped some of the books up there that have helped me kind of research some of this kind of idea of what's happening in our culture and what, as my bishop would call it, my Bishop Justin would call it, the kind of cultural angst of our time in the Western church, which we know is in decline, in terms of numerically in decline. And my particular context has been as a family member affected by people who are alcoholics, but I think it's really important, and through some of the reading I've done, to acknowledge that we can substitute alcoholism with any consequence of a much wider landscape of disconnection. And so what I've discovered myself in the rooms is I may not have a problem with alcohol, but I'm certainly not sober in my thinking or in my emotions at times. And so this kind of idea of we're living in a culture of disconnect, and Johann Hari's book there, Lost Connections, was really helpful in just as a sociologist, I guess, identifying that we are more disconnected than ever from meaningful work, from our values, from childhood, from trauma, from status and respect, even from the natural world. And people are disconnected from a hope for a better future, or a more secure future, probably. And so kind of in this cultural sense of disconnection, and Christian authors and psychologists and sociologists are people that I looked at in doing this work. Basically, the idea that Christian communities aren't immune to the things that we turn to construct our identity. If we are in a place of disconnection ourselves, or even as communities of faith. And Teresa Latini, in her book The Church and the Crisis of Community, just writes about modernity and its impacts on the community's role in our formation. And so when we're disconnected from that community or tradition or the things that help us make meaning in our lives, we turn inwards to construct our identity. And she suggests that the church is at risk of two extreme postures of either fundamentalism as a response of that, so are trying to hold on to those things deeply that have helped, that aid us to construct our identity, or sort of a cosmopolitan type religion where we can kind of just, and at too extreme, you just pick and choose whatever we like, and I guess the two extremes of the posture that the church could take. But Latina suggests in quite a jaw-dropping quote that we have to face our high opinion of ourselves. And I guess that is one of the things that as a person myself in recovery that I've had to come to face, is my own high opinion of myself at times, amongst all of the good things that I hold as the person that I am. So we'll move on. So the task of this research involved looking at literature, researching with a case study group using pastoral ethnographic method, which is really I asked a case study group of people involved in a recovery church in Auckland what the strengths and benefits of the 12-step program were and how they felt the church might be enhanced by them. I consulted Christian theologians around themes of weakness and the cross and the invitation for the church to engage in imagination and prophetic imagination, and also the invitation to perhaps do some quite major rethinking around the place of weakness and the weak and who we would consider to be the most helpless or those in most desperate need in our society. The findings were kind of gathered from the case study's web-based literature, as well as I went along to some of this particular recovery church based on the 12 steps. I went along to some of their meetings and I observed, I did some observation through that, and then out of that research identified some key themes for analysis. And I guess the hope for this research has got two things. It's that the wider church might firstly be encouraged in its task of mission and ministry in a disconnected society, and also that the wider church and its leaders might be willing to use Nadia Bowles-Weber's kind of analogy, take a walk from the sanctuary to the basement, and to just be open to considering what the 12-step program might have to offer in its missional task. It's not about the church feeling like they have to become a 12-step program. It's not about the church trying to think about how to make their church friendlier for addicts. That's not the focus of this work. It's more been around listening to what participants who are involved in the 12-step programs might want to say to the church, and what we might learn and be perhaps open to considering. So the next slide, my slides, I don't know if they're helpful. Some people like slides, some people hate them. Just put them up. Bit of a history of the 12-step program for you. Not going to go into a whole heap of it, but essentially it's 85 years old, the 12-step program. It's got over 100,000 groups worldwide. It's been the longest mutual aid group for people with alcoholism or any kind of substance use disorder. You can pretty much find a 12-step program now in any kind of anything really. There's as you see here, there's Debtors Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, AA, and the fellowship that I'm most familiar with is the Al-Anon family groups. So in terms of just quick sort of landscape, this big picture on the left is the Oxford group. This was led by Frank Buchanan. This is all in America. He met two guys who had previously met who struggled with alcoholism themselves in about 1935. Early kind of approaches to dealing with alcoholism were really around temperance, like we see this as moral sin, and so we just need to not drink and that will be fine. These two met, Dr. Bob and Bill Wilson. They met and they shared their own experience of being alcoholics, and they found that in sharing their experience with one another, they were able to maintain sobriety. And that led them to the Oxford group, which at the time was you may know about it, it was a Christian movement happening at the time. And there was some affinity between these groups that worked for a while. But what Dr. Bob and Bill Wilson kind of, from my understanding, realised was that the language around that the Oxford group was using at the time was, they didn't believe, accessible to people who weren't in church or didn't not understand Christian jargon. And so, actually on reflection myself, as I'd gone back and looked at this to prepare for tonight, it really stood out to me that language is something that is really important in the way that we communicate what we're about in the church. Some people, some of the critiques are that it is very secular. There's, slowly the kind of 12-step program has drifted out of the church. But, I think some of the findings from the reading I've done do affirm that that the 12 steps acknowledge that the program does depend on a sustained relationship with God. And it acknowledges addiction less as moral sin now and more as, it has always acknowledged it as a spiritual illness. And in Al-Anon, for example, the illness is not the substance use, it's more about the kind of relational issues or challenges that one might have as a result of being affected by the disease. Dallas Willard, in his book Renovation of the Heart, which you might see a bit later, he basically names that 12-step groups they gained their powers from Christian sources to meet the needs that Christian institutions of the time weren't. And maybe this is still something for us to reflect on today, and that the fact that many of the 12-step groups are more or less leaseholders in our church buildings, and there's quite a disconnect between what happens in the basement and what happens in the sanctuary. Not everywhere, but yeah. So moving on to the literature that I had a look at. There's just a few of some of the books I looked at, and so I used the literature from the AA fellowship itself. I also consulted theologians such as James K. Smith and Marva Dawn, looking at kind of themes of weakness, and then Richard Rohr around spiritual formation and the prophetic imagination of Walter Brueggemann. And late in the piece, this book came to my attention, which was Why Can't the Church Be More Like an AA Meeting? It was like, a book's been written about exactly what I've just started researching. How's time going, Sheridan? I might need you to give me some, because I think I've maybe prepared way too much.
Okay, well, you're going really well at the moment.
Okay, maybe just give me a 5-minute warning and then maybe a 2-minute warning, something like that. Is that okay with everyone?
Okay, do you want another 5 minutes or another 10 minutes? What do you need?
I reckon another 5 at least, yeah.
I'll tell you when you've had.
Is that okay with everyone?
I'm saying it's fine.
You guys tracking okay? Good. So if you want to, Richard Rohr particularly locates the 12-step program alongside other spiritual formation programs, actually. So he doesn't think about it as this separate sort of a thing, but he would say it has efficacy in its own right as a spiritual formation program, and that we need to be considering it alongside perhaps some of our other spiritual formation programs that we offer. And he also names the disconnect between the basement and the sanctuaries. He says that 12-steppers think that they've left the church and that now they go to a Wednesday night program instead. And maybe people in the church presume that their higher concerns are something different with the problems of those downstairs. And so it is uncomfortable. It's an uncomfortable challenge to think about, perhaps having to consider our own opinion of ourselves, and to perhaps think about resembling a broken kind of fellowship of people who are in desperate need, But the 12-step culture does possess something that the church may have lost, and and could potentially get back. So why is it effective, or how is it effective? That's my next slide. It's a bit personal to me, but there's a picture of my on here of my husband who passed away because of alcoholism. And one of the not last emails, he sent me an email once and he summed up the 12-step program like this: I can't, God can. Let's clean up the wreckage of the past and help someone else. And this is a bit of a summary here in the picture of the 12 steps. I can definitely, put you in touch with how you can find the 12 steps in full if you want, but they're kind of summarized in 12-step groups around these three kind of like, I can't do it, first 3 steps, but God can. So I admit I can't do it. The next 3, the middle grouping of steps is, cleaning, kind of taking inventory, both of our strengths and our weaknesses. It's not all bad. Becoming willing to make amends if we need to. Kind of looking at our history, looking at our past, making amends if it's not going to do further damage. And then how do we then continue to live in that liberation and that freedom that we find as we do work this spiritual program to give that message away to others. So I sort of sum up the efficacy of it in these 3: honesty, openness, and willingness. This is how we do it. And so all of the literature that I looked into, from the social sciences perspective, it definitely there's effectiveness in maintaining sobriety. It's proven to follow a 12-step program. From a Christian author or a church practitioner perspective, this idea of small groups, of honesty, willingness, and openness is all confirmed in the literature that I've read around, how we respond to this cultural angst and time that we're in. And small groups came out as a really key idea in that reading. And then kind of theologically, this idea of, engaging in our prophetic imagination, of thinking about how things might be done differently is the invitation here, I think, or could be done differently. What we could bring in from programs like this to enhance our existing worship and our existing communities. So the values that seem to come out of the literature were honesty, openness, and willingness, alongside the findings from the case studies and the questionnaires and the people that I talked to. So the findings, just to go on a little bit further into that, this is the next slide. The key things that came out, and I'm sorry about all the words on there, I went a bit overboard with the words, you can read them if you like, but faith and spirituality, the environment and the culture of the group seem to be the things that really were the key themes that came out of the data, that came out of the questionnaires and spending time with the case study group. One person said, you progress. You can sit quite comfortably in church. You can sit relatively passively and not actively be walking your talk. That would be beneficial to a church, to have accountable people. They disciple. There are a lot of people just floating in church and not growing. One member from the group that I interviewed said that she had come from a different tradition, I will say that, a different Christian tradition, but she did say that this idea of, if I'm doing good, then God must be blessing me, things must be really good, but if you're not sort of succeeding or you're struggling in some churches, you kind of not looked at the same, she said, and she's learnt that her value comes from being a person, not because of what I do. And the gifts come not because I'm sitting on $1 million, but because I have experienced serenity. And so this idea that participation and responsibility in a spiritual faith environment that enabled people to remain connected to God, themselves and others was really important to the people that I interviewed. At worst, they did share stories of how distorted theology had caused serious harm and resulting in shame and isolation from the church. The environment, I've talked quite a bit about that. Words like non-judgmental, confidential, supportive, people walking the talk rather than kind of do-gooder Christians who just want to help people. And just a real place of being able to be honest. And then the group culture with things like not trying to fix each other, making amends where necessary, telling the truth in an atmosphere of love and acceptance. So, yeah, I mean, some quite poignant things were shared, and I just don't have enough time to talk about it all. The last slide quickly will be sort of all the things I talked about in my discussion section, but I'll just sort of summarise it if I can. And there's a few quotes there. I wanted to share this story. There's a picture of sort of what would look like, you know, it is people in most desperate need in the city that I live in. And I was with somebody, a friend of mine in town, and we were just walking past, and someone engaged with me and who was clearly struggling with addiction, and said to me, my friend that I was with at the time said, "Oh, she's training to be a priest." And I was like, "Don't do that." But this person just got down straight on their knees and said, "Please pray for me. I just want to be a good person." And that sort of honesty and vulnerability for me just sort of really stood out to me. And, you know, I was then made to feel quite uncomfortable about my own vulnerability. And I just, not everybody, you know, I'm not saying that everybody is called into that particular context, but I just think rather than saying that we have something to go and do for the people who seem to be most challenged and most disconnected in the world, perhaps those people that we might have stereotyped might actually have something to teach us if we can find a way to bridge that gap and to listen. So in summary, the kind of key things that I'd leave us with to think about. I've written them down here, I think. Yeah, so I don't think the church is being asked to become a program itself, a 12-step program, but to be open to looking at its strengths and benefits. Recognising that thousands of people around the world have found belonging in a group of culture and honesty, open and willingness. Leaders must be willing to open the boxes of resources available to them that might have been neglected. You know, the church has got lots of incredible roots of spiritual formation that perhaps we might have neglected, or even the 12 steps might actually be one that we haven't thought of ever being connected to our Christian tradition at all. But to do that, we also have to be willing to be honest enough and to confront and celebrate our own lives and the treasures that we might find there when we do it. Discarding ideologies that no longer serve a purpose, or embracing spiritual practices that we've never thought about before, like the 12 steps. Advocating for safe, welcoming and healthy communities of faith, and having a strong commitment to accurate and accountable theology. And it could just be as simple as learning about the 12 steps. If you've got a group in your church, ask if you can attend some meetings. Just go along. You don't have to share, but maybe, you know, what we could find. And just lastly, recognising that, you know, Jesus actually is the leader of this scandalous kingdom that we're trying to serve, and just to love the church despite all of its flaws and its addictive tendencies, because we are all in recovery of some kind. So that's all from me. Wish I could talk longer. I've got so much I'd love to say, but I'll listen now. Thanks for asking me to do it.
Thank you so much, Jax, for everything that you've said tonight. I was writing down some of your marvellous phrases, and I think you've really exemplified them: the honesty, the willingness, the openness, speaking truth to our own lives, and engaging in prophetic imagination. So It's just been an absolutely wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. And I'm sure that there'll be people that would like to